When a billionaire CEO revealed his true financial wisdom, the janitor's incredible response tragically might change everything. James scrubbed the marble floors of the penthouse suite, the rhythmic motion of the mop a strange comfort against the towering chaos of his life. He had spent years cleaning up after the elite, staring into the gilded lives of those who could afford to vanish into the clouds of their extravagant offices. As every drop of sweat mingled with the powerful perfume of corporate ambition, he silently battled the weight of his responsibilities, an ailing father who had worn the uniform and a daughter, Lily, who aspired to break free from the constraints of his meager salary. On a rainy afternoon, as the sky wept gray against the city skyline, disaster struck. He heard the sharp crack of a briefcase snapping open, followed by a splatter of hot coffee on his polished floor. He turned just in time to see Richard Lawson, the billionaire CEO, flustered and embarrassed, standing in a puddle of his own making. In that moment of vulnerability, James felt something unexpected, a stirring of connection across the chasm of class, a reminder that even the exalted could stumble. "Help me get this coffee out of my suit," Richard exclaimed, his voice betraying a rare hint of unease. Wordlessly, they both knelt to clean the mess, their hands brushing against the damp fabric and slick floor. Richard began sharing insights about wealth management, discussing dividends and investments as if he were revealing secrets to a trusted confidant. Each word thrust a beam of hope through James's clouded heart, piercing the fog of financial despair. Here was a glimmer of wisdom, lessons that had always seemed a world away. Months fluttered by, and James put Richard's advice into practice. Living thrifty, he sacrificed little comforts, pouring what savings he managed into a college fund for Lily. No longer a mere janitor, he felt a flicker of empowerment. Each dollar saved was a step toward a brighter future. But the exhilaration was matched by a creeping dread, deeper than ever before. Nothing came without a price. As Richard announced company-wide layoffs, James's heart sank. The man who had handed him hope turned predatory, threatening the livelihoods of those who, like him, had been clinging to survival. His thoughts spiraled into turmoil. The betrayal stung with bitter irony. Richard's words of wisdom now felt tainted. How could he reconcile the man who had once buoyed him with guidance against the one who wielded a guillotine over his colleagues' futures? Was James's loyalty misplaced? His loyal heart struggled against the harsh reality of corporate greed. It was a moral dilemma that gnawed at him. Could he confront Richard without being seen as just a janitor, another faceless cog in a relentless machine? The stories his father told him of honor echoed in his ears. His fingers clenched into fists as he paced the empty lobby beneath the glittering chandeliers of the skyscraper. Would Richard listen to a humble janitor? Would he see the humanity behind the numbers? The tension within James swelled, threatening to explode, and he knew he had to stand up not just for himself, but for all those who relied on their jobs to survive. Just as he gathered the courage to confront Richard, the office door creaked open. James's breath hitched. There stood Richard, a shadow of uncertainty crossing his face. "James, I didn't expect to see you here," he said, confusion and vulnerability mingling in his tone. The gulf between their worlds hung heavy in the air, an electric tension pulsing with the weight of unspoken words. Would this encounter build a bridge, or merely deepen the chasm? James's heart raced, the stakes greater than he had ever anticipated, and in that moment, their fates intertwined and the anxiety surged. James's mind was a whirlwind of conflicting emotions. The moment had arrived. Here stood Richard Lawson, the very man whose teachings had ignited a flicker of hope in his drab life. Yet that hope now felt tainted by the impending layoffs. James could sense the tension crackling in the air, a palpable reminder of the stakes at hand. He took a deep breath, grounding himself in the uncertainty of the moment. "Richard," he began, his voice tinged with hesitation. He never imagined he would be on this side of the conversation. He was a janitor, a man of humble means, but today, he felt the shift within him, a newfound determination that came with confronting his own fears. Richard's brow furrowed, concern glimmering in his sharp, blue eyes. "What brings you here?" The question felt like a doorway, an opening to the dialogue he had long mulled over during countless hours spent scrubbing floors. Would this be a moment of clarity or a surge of confrontation? James squared his shoulders, spurred by the memories of those he worked alongside, many of whom supported families. "I want to talk about the layoffs," he said, now emboldened. "You have the power to change lives. But are you aware of the weight behind your decisions?" Richard recoiled slightly, his discomfort evident. "Business is business, James. Sometimes tough choices must be made to ensure the company's health." James felt the anger rise within him, the indignation bubbling like a geyser ready to erupt. "But at what cost? Those are lives you're choosing to toss aside. You taught me that wealth management is not just about the numbers, it's about people." In that moment, he saw the billionaire's facade crack, if only for a fraction of a second. Richard's posture softened as he searched for words, but James pressed on, driven by a steely resolve. "I listened when you spoke. I took your lessons to heart. But those lessons can't just apply to me while ignoring the impact you're having on others." Richard, still taken aback, took a moment to gauge the man before him. The humble janitor, now transformed into an advocate. "It's complicated, James. I have shareholders to answer to. It's about long-term viability," he replied, but the words were faltering, and James knew he had struck a nerve. Yet James couldn't relent. "Viability shouldn't come at the cost of humanity," he said, frustration tinged with urgency filling his tone. "You can leverage your power, influence change, shift paradigms. But you have to care. How can anyone justify a decision that disregards families?" He could see Richard's defenses building, ready to fortify against his accusations. But for James, pointing out the ethical dilemma at play was not just an exercise in speaking truth to power, it was a learning experience for himself, a test of the values he wished to uphold. Richard shifted his gaze, his thoughts clearly racing. For the first time, he seemed more than just a ruler on his throne. James's words hung in the air like lead weights, sinking deeply into the fabric of an uneasy compromise. The silence expanded, thick with tension, as Richard opened his mouth to respond but then closed it again. In this charged moment, James felt an unexpected rush of clarity. This confrontation was not merely about addressing Richard's power or the impending layoffs, it was about his own personal evolution. He could no longer cower behind a mop, afraid of the implications of his thoughts. He had a voice, and today it rang with a different kind of authority. The atmosphere shifted as minds collided, but the gap remained. Would Richard truly absorb this challenge, or would he default to cold calculations? James held his breath, heart pounding, knowing the outcome might reveal not just the billionaire's character, but also the true depths of his own burgeoning courage. Just then, Richard's gaze sharpened, a spark igniting as he seemed to contemplate James's words seriously for the first time. "Perhaps there's more to discuss than I realized," he admitted slowly, and James felt hope surge once more. Was it possible that this confrontation could lead to something meaningful? Yet somewhere in the back of his mind, an unsettling thought crept in. Even if Richard opened up, what would they find hidden beneath the surface? The stakes were much higher than either had anticipated. The path forward was uncertain, fraught with the potential for growth or failure. With an unsteady heart, James prepared for the next step in this unfolding narrative. What would they uncover as their worlds collided? The moment hung in the balance, daubed in shades of vulnerability and looming challenge. James could feel his pulse quicken as he watched Richard's expression shift. The billionaire's guarded demeanor had given way to a flicker of contemplation, an openness that was foreign to both of them. Yet, with that flicker came an unnerving feeling. What if this vulnerability was merely a facade, a temporary crack in the armor? "Let us have that discussion, then," Richard said, breaking the silence and gesturing toward a conference room just beyond them. The invitation felt heavy, like stepping through the unknown. James nodded, squaring his shoulders once more, mentally preparing for the critical dialogue that lay ahead. Once inside, the vastness of the conference room intimidated him. The high ceilings loomed overhead, the sleek table polished to a gloss that mirrored the tension in the air. Richard took a seat opposite him, leaning forward slightly, a shift in strategy. James, however, remained standing, a deliberate choice to assert his newfound authority. "Thank you," James said, his voice steady. "For hearing me out." Richard acknowledged him with a nod, but his gaze was keen, almost predatory. "You've made some serious accusations, James. I'd like to understand your perspective better." James took a deep breath, the weight of their conversation settling in. "I understand you have responsibilities to your shareholders, but the decisions you make echo in real lives. What are the values that underpin your choices?" Richard's brow furrowed again. "Financial stability is my priority. You, of all people, should understand that." The words were firm, but James sensed a hint of defensiveness. They were a beat in Richard's rhythm of justifications. "Financial stability, yes, but at the expense of well-being? Your teachings involve creating sustainable wealth. Do you not believe that social responsibility is part of that equation?" James pressed, leaning slightly forward, unafraid of the financial mogul's reputation. The billionaire momentarily faltered, his eyes narrowing as if he were weighing the cost of this conversation, of engaging with someone he once viewed as just a custodian. This was not merely an intellectual sparring match, this was James's chance to challenge the kind of thinking that had relegated him to the shadows for so long. As Richard opened his mouth to respond, James quickly added, "I've been told I'm just a janitor, that I'm insignificant. But my experiences have equipped me with insights you might overlook. In valuing people over profits, you create a foundation that fosters loyalty and commitment." The air thickened between them, the stakes climbing higher. Richard remained silent, and in his stillness, James saw a rare opportunity, the realization that perhaps, deep within Richard, a change lay dormant, awaiting provocation. "Let me ask you this, do you believe you can sacrifice a few for the good of many? Or, can you create an environment where everyone can thrive?" Richard's expression wrinkled in thought as he toyed with an unseen inner conflict. James knew this wasn't merely a matter of policy, this was about a moral recalibration, about redefining success in a world that often glorified ruthlessness. As the tension wrapped around them, James could feel the urgency clawing at him. He needed Richard to not only hear him, but to absorb the lesson buried within. If he could advocate for his peers, for those discarded with little thought, perhaps it signified more than just a conversation. It could represent a genuine pivot in their dynamic. "The time for change is now, Richard," James stated, his voice low yet firm. "What will you choose to do with your power? Use it to continue a cycle that harms, or leverage it to drive positive transformation?" Richard's eyes sparked again, but this time, it was not the glimmer of defiance. It was something deeper, a flicker of curiosity, perhaps even empathy. What would this moment yield? The fear of failure mingled with the possibility of awakening a dormant sense of purpose in Richard. Yet as James laid bare his beliefs, a shadow cut through the budding hope, a reminder that change was often met with resistance. The question loomed, would Richard embrace the path of transformation or cling to the familiar comforts of the past? James's heart raced as he waited for Richard's response, knowing that this moment could alter the trajectory of both their lives irrevocably. Richard regarded him silently, and for a moment, the air was charged with possibility. Would they step together into a new era of understanding, or would James be forced to confront the bitter truth of a heart entrenched in self-interest? As the moment stretched, James felt the weight of destiny pressing down upon him, awaiting the pivotal turn that would define their fates. The tension was palpable, swirling with potential, as the path forward hung tenuously in the balance. Richard's silence stretched, crackling with tension. James could sense the billionaire's gears turning, an inscrutable mix of contemplation and resistance etched across his face. It was a delicate dance, an unexpected moment that seemed to blur the lines of power and vulnerability. After what felt like an eternity, Richard leaned back, his fingers steepled. "You're passionate, I'll give you that," he finally replied, a hint of reflection in his tone. "But passion alone won't change a billion-dollar enterprise. It's not that simple. Maybe it's as simple as choosing to see people as more than just numbers on a balance sheet," James countered, his voice steady but laced with urgency. There's so much power in empathy. It can transform culture and create value well beyond what spreadsheets show. He watched as Richard's brow furrowed again, the flickers of defiance melting into a dangerous curiosity. James understood that navigating the chambers of Richard's mind was akin to traversing a thick fog, each step cautious yet resolute, unveiling visions buried deep within. You speak of empathy as if it's a fix-all. But what does that even look like in a corporate environment? Richard challenged, his tone a mixture of skepticism and intrigue. It was a window, the first crack in Richard's fortifications that James had longed for. Let's look at the current turnover rates, James proposed, his mind racing through the evidence. Those numbers reflect dissatisfaction. If you rebuild trust, you foster loyalty. If your employees feel valued, productivity and innovation will inevitably follow. Isn't that the hallmark of sustainable success? Richard's fingers drummed lightly on the polished table, an action that belied the simmering thoughts beneath. James could almost feel the billionaire weighing each of James's words against a lifetime of learned precedents, each financial decision shaped by the unwavering certainty of profit margins and shareholder satisfaction. I've spent years mentoring people to maximize profitability, Richard retorted, but the conviction started to wane. You can't deny the harsh realities of the business world. I'm not denying that, James replied, cutting through the fog of doubt. But you must recognize we are in a pivotal moment. The world is changing. Companies that thrive today are the ones that adapt not just in terms of products and services, but in values. There it was, a challenge to the fabric of Richard's long-held beliefs, crafted not from resentment but from a place of shared human experience. Richard's gaze turned to the glass windows, overlooking the sprawling city that mirrored their conversation, reflective, vast, and filled with potential yet shrouded in complexity. James watched as emotions played across the billionaire's face, flickers of realization dancing at the edges, a moment of personal reckoning. Yet even as Richard appeared to consider the implications of this discourse, a vulnerability threatened James. What if the flickering interest was just a momentary blip? Would Richard dismiss the notion as a fleeting fancy once they separated? James felt a chill run down his spine, doubt whispering that his voice might disappear into the void. James, Richard said after a long pause, his voice lower now, burdened with contemplation. If what you're saying holds any truth, it would require a monumental shift not just in me, but in how this corporation operates. The gravity of those words hung heavy in the air. James realized this was no longer mere conversation, it was an invitation to transformation, to change the narrative not just for Richard, but for an entire enterprise. Then why not start with you? James urged, the intensity of the moment an echo of the uncertainty that plagued his own journey. Every leader creates ripples. Choosing the path of empathy and responsibility may be the most lucrative decision you'll ever make. Richard's gaze lingered, deep in thought, and for the first time, doubt began to flicker in the billionaire's eyes. The tension in the room morphed as a new landscape of possibility emerged. But as James awaited Richard's acknowledgement of this path forward, doubts raced through his mind. Was he ready for the fallout that could arise if he succeeded in awakening change? Just then, a sudden realization struck him: this wasn't solely about making a case for reform. It was also about his own journey of becoming, of stepping fully into the role of an advocate, challenging the label of janitor as a limitation. Are you willing to take that leap, Richard? James pressed, determination growing. This was more than a negotiation, this was a psychological shift, a defining moment where both their fates could intertwine in the pursuit of greater meaning. Richard's eyes bore into his with an intensity that suggested the crux of their conversation was reaching a pivotal threshold. In that suspended moment, James could feel the burgeoning possibility cascade over him. But before Richard could respond, a sudden knock shattered the atmosphere, followed by the door swinging open to reveal a sharply dressed boardroom executive. Upon seeing the tense scene before him, confusion flickered in his eyes. James's heart sank as he realized the moment was slipping from their grasp. The opportunity for transformative dialogue hung precariously in the air. Would he lose Richard's commitment just as he was on the cusp of profound change? The stark reality began weighing heavily on James, as he braced for the impending disruption. How many chances would he get to awaken the empathy dormant within Richard? Would the momentary distraction derail the emerging connection, or could it crystallize their path forward together? James felt the air shift as the boardroom executive stepped across the threshold. The sharp click of his shoes echoed, shattering the fragile moment that had formed between him and Richard. It was a reminder of the malignant business politics that loomed outside the sanctuary they had created with their conversation. Am I interrupting something important? The executive smirked, sensing the tension, and James felt the pressure mount. Richard's eyes narrowed slightly, a fleeting annoyance evident, but it was quickly eclipsed by the mask of professionalism he donned so easily. As the executive rattled off updates with a confident bravado, James found himself wrestling internally. Here he was, once a mere janitor, unexpectedly thrust into the spotlight, only for it to be dimmed by a newcomer. Why was he so suddenly rendered smaller in this space? Determined not to fade into the background, James interjected. Actually, I think what we're discussing is foundational to the future of this company, he remarked, his heart pounding as he steeled himself for the ridicule that often followed his engagement in corporate dialogues. Richard shot him an almost appreciative glance, the flicker of vulnerability from their earlier exchange igniting anew. It was as if his conviction was building a protective armor against the potential dismissals, both personal and professional. The executive paused, visibly taken aback by James's direct involvement. And you are? James, he replied firmly, I'm part of the facilities team here, but more importantly, I've seen how culture affects performance in a tangible way. And you think that's your place to dictate? The executive challenged, a smirk playing on his lips, mocking James's authority. The atmosphere thickened, the weight of judgment looming larger. Doubt seeped into James's resolve, whispering that perhaps he did not belong in these discussions. But then, an ember of his determination flared. This was the moment he needed to embrace, rather than step back from. Yes, James asserted, his voice steadier. I understand the pulse of the company moves beyond numbers. It lives in the minds and hearts of those who labor with pride or with discontent. Ignoring human factors is detrimental. Richard leaned forward, and the surprise on the executive's face was evident as he realized James wasn't backing down. You would do well to listen, the billionaire affirmed, shotting James an encouraging look that reminded him of their shared aim. With that unexpected backing, James's heart soared. It appeared Richard was willing to make a stand, and as he watched the tension in the executive's jaw tighten, James felt a growing sense of agency. This was not merely about winning a debate, it was about recalibrating the lens through which people in power viewed their employees. Do we really want to risk the morale of our workforce for short-term goals? James continued, driving the point with clarity. Imagine investing in empathy as a leadership style instead. The corporations that demonstrate this empathy adapt best in inevitably turbulent waters. Every word packed with intensity, he could see the landscape of Richard's thoughts shift again, as if his psyche were reorganizing itself. Perhaps Richard was beginning to see that James could provide the insight he needed to embrace this grand pivot, one where empathy could weave through the company's fabric. Moments stretched out while Richard responded to the executive, who now watched with a mix of curiosity and apprehension, but James remained vigilant, pushing past the doubt that begged for him to retreat. James touches on a key point here, and I want to explore it further, Richard declared, and just like that, the tide began to turn once more. But before the moment could fully blossom into something transformative, the executive interrupted with a dismissive snort. We'll revisit this later, Richard. We have a profit to chase. A swell of frustration bubbled within James, but before he could voice his irritation, Richard's sharp gaze met his, and James read a silent agreement looming between them. Perhaps the battle for empathy was still in its infancy, but with each hesitation and every confrontation, connections were being forged that promised deeper revelations. As the boardroom executive exited, James turned back toward Richard, heart racing with both apprehension and a wild hope. Are you still ready to take that leap? He breathed, surprised by his own audacity. Richard's brow furrowed, caught in the tide of his conflicting thoughts, but what James noticed was a hint of resolve beginning to seep through. "James, if we're going to change this company, it needs to come from a powerful place," Richard murmured, as if clarity was peeking through mere suspicion. But to create that shift, Richard would need to confront the very system he had thrived in for so long. And suddenly, James was faced with a revelation that his journey wasn't just about advocating for change, it was about guiding Richard through his own transformation. Could they truly redefine the future of the company together? As uncertainty swirled around them, James realized they were on the brink of a pioneering shift. But the question swirled like a storm cloud: would Richard be able to withstand the backlash from his peers? "No more delays," James whispered, voice firm with conviction, his pulse quickening. And as Richard stared at the horizon of possibilities, the moment of truth loomed larger than ever. Would he choose to embrace empathy, or would he retreat into the familiar, abandoning everything they had just begun to build? The air crackled with tension, the future hanging delicately in the balance. Now, it was time to face the consequences or the triumphs of their choices, and James knew that this step could define something greater than either of them had ever anticipated, both personally and professionally. James left the boardroom feeling like a boxer who just emerged from a grueling match. Adrenaline coursed through his veins, yet doubt still slumbered in the back of his mind. He had taken a risk by speaking up, but in the face of corporate cynicism, was he any closer to the change he was so desperate to see? As he walked down the hall, the polished floors reflecting overhead lights, he could feel the tension in the atmosphere, from the lurking uncertainties of Richard's future decisions, to his own place within a company that seemed intent on chase-only profit. Had he truly made an impact, or was he simply filling air with brave words that would fade into the void of abandoned ideas? Finding solace in a narrow alcove, James took a deep breath, attempting to summon the composure he desperately needed. The whispers from his earlier self began to surface again, those echoes of a janitor who knew nothing of the corporate world. But could he allow that legacy to define him? Perhaps he wasn't in that storied past any longer, the path he had walked wasn't an obstacle but a resource. His sweeping knowledge of the facility, the people working within it, and the way they thrived or struggled under the weight of corporate indifference became his ammunition. Empathy should be the new currency in this company, he murmured to himself, the phrase suddenly articulating the inner conviction that flickered within him. With renewed purpose, James returned to his desk, the sounds of distant brainstorming sessions and someone tapping away on a keyboard solidifying his intent. He needed to find ways to support Richard's vision for a culture shift. He had to be ready to meet him at every crossroads. A change of leadership style could only thrive through sustained dialogue, not just isolated confrontations in the boardroom. He began crafting a proposal incorporating anecdotes he had gathered during his time among the employees. Rather than traditional metrics of success, what if he posed insights derived from human connections, how morale improved when staff felt valued? Each story he scribbled was a brick in the foundation of understanding he hoped to build between Richard and the rest of the company. An hour later, the proposal felt incomplete, but it was an honest effort, an illustration of the workforce as human beings first, employees second. Exhaustion soon curled at the edges of his resolve, yet he pressed on. He was determined to finish his plan before the day ended, bolstered by the thought of how vital the document could be in the conversations to come. Just as he finished the last touches, the door to the room clicked open, revealing Richard with his suit jacket casually slung over one arm, fatigue lining the billionaire's features. The moment hung between them, electric with unsaid words. "I was hoping to catch you," Richard said, stepping into the room. He looked as if he was balancing the weight of 100 decisions. James motioned toward the desk. "I've been working on something that might help with the ideas we discussed earlier." His heart raced. This was their opportunity for collaboration, one where both of them could shape the narrative together. Richard smiled, a softening of his demeanor that made James momentarily forget the uncertainty that had clouded their earlier discussions. "Let us hear it." As James laid out his proposal, he felt the atmosphere in the room shift, the unease that had gripped Richard began to lighten. Questions flowed freely, as Richard delved into the possibilities intertwining empathy and business, the fine line they walked between compassion and capitalism. Yet, a looming anxiety wrapped around James, a stark reminder that the next steps would not only determine Richard's course but also challenge the ideas that society had ingrained in him since childhood. What if Richard remained resistant? Or worse, what if the initiative faltered under the pressure of established corporate wisdom? As they discussed the details, every word exchanged reinforced the possibility of transformation. But as the conversation deepened, James's gut twisted with a harsh realization. "Richard," James began, uncertainty clinging to his voice. "What happens if they reject this? If they see it as a power threat?" Richard paused, his steely eyes meeting James's. "Then we'll learn from it and adapt. Letting fear dictate our choices only ensures we remain shackled to the past." With that simple yet powerful answer, James saw it clearly. This wasn't merely about advocating for change. It was a personal ascent into a role he never dreamed he could take, an agent of transformation, urging for a shift in his mentor and the world around him. For the first time, he realized this was not just Richard's journey, but his own. "Together, we'll navigate the backlash, whatever it may be," James whispered, uncertainty still lingering, but resolve igniting beneath the surface. Now it appeared they were standing once more at the precipice of bravery. The next move could lead them into a new era or deeper into conflict. Would Richard truly fight for change, or would they both retreat back to comfort? As tensions swirled around their vision, James couldn't shake the feeling that the true challenge was yet to come. James stood at the intersection of ambition and trepidation. In that moment, he realized they were on the edge not just of a potential movement within the company but of a profound shift within himself. The dynamic between him and Richard had evolved. The fight for change was no longer an abstract battle of ideas but a personal crusade. Days drifted into weeks, and the reality of their ambitious proposal began to sink into the fabric of the company. James became a quieter force, listening intently during meetings and observing how Richard navigated the corporate landscape. Each day he noticed Richard facing subtle resistance from other board members, those who preferred traditional strategies of profit over the emotional intelligence James championed. Watching Richard handle these pushbacks evoked a cocktail of admiration and anxiety in James. He found himself at a fork in the road. Should he bolster Richard's efforts or prepare for fallout? Each interaction served as a masterclass in leadership, displaying Richard's navigating of corporate politics with a measured calm that James envied. "Empathy is measurable," Richard declared one afternoon in a strategy session, punctuating his words with confidence. "It might not show on the balance sheet today, but in the long run, it retains health in our workforce. A happy employee equals a productive one." The boardroom murmured skeptically, each furrowed brow echoing years of entrenched hierarchy that resisted fluid change. James felt his heart race. Here was evidence that Richard was embracing a transformative path, but doubt lingered in the air. Would it be enough? Amidst this corporate tension, James spent his evenings poring over studies of workplaces that flourished through empathetic leadership. Armed with research, he crafted data points and case studies, solidifying the rationale behind their proposal. He was determined to step up, not merely as a support for Richard, but as an indispensable partner leading the charge. Slowly, he began to unveil a dormant confidence. The morning arrived when Richard invited James to present their findings to the entire board. The very request felt like a crucible moment for James, a test of his readiness to challenge the status quo. Hours before the presentation, doubt crept in, whispering venomous questions about his qualifications. Yet every time fear echoed, James countered with the stories he noted from fellow employees. These anecdotes had become his scaffolding, proving that the human experience is as critical to success as any financials. As the board gathered, anticipation hung thick in the air. James stood beside Richard, acutely aware of the weight of the moment. The lights dimmed, and with a steady voice, James began to present. He narrated tales of teamwork and resilience among employees, painting vivid images of the struggle against indifference they faced daily. Empathy isn't softness. It's strategic strength, he asserted, feeling his heartbeat sync with his words. The flicker of acknowledgement on some board members' faces ignited a spark within him, a growing belief that they could navigate this tumultuous journey together. Yet, as he wrapped up, applause erupted sparingly, mixed with the hesitant exchanges of skeptical board members. The stony faces of a few lingered on him, offering not assurance but warning. James caught Richard's eye, seeing both determination and doubt reflected, and felt a firm resolve solidify within him. He was now fully invested in this experiment, taking ownership not just in thought but in action. Outside the meeting room, James collapsed into a chair, fatigue washing over him. Richard joined him moments later, the buzz of the boardroom still lingering in the air. "You did well," Richard praised, though the gravity hung heavily between them. "But the psychological barrier is high. We can't afford to lose momentum." Days flowed into a confluence of ongoing discussions with the board, and soon James found himself facing an unexpected adversary, Claire, a younger but ambitious board member known for her analytical prowess and unwavering pursuit of profit margins. She questioned every aspect of their proposition, presenting graphs and projections that underscored hesitance. James felt the scrutiny like a spotlit interrogation, and yet there was an unlikely thrill in the challenge. "James, do you really believe a shift toward empathy will yield better margins?" Claire's voice dripped with doubt during one heated discussion. Her question cracked open self-reflective layers of his resolve. Did he believe it? In that moment, he questioned whether he was advocating for a cause or simply clinging to idealism. "I believe it has the potential to create a more engaged workforce," he replied, but the tremor in his voice revealed the simmering doubt lurking beneath his confidence. Returning home that night, he wrestled with the implications of Claire's challenge. The encounter had ignited a flicker of fear that there were limits to empathy's power. Was he fighting a battle against immovable corporate wisdom, or had he merely exhorted his intuition to lead them all to ruin? The following day evolved into a whirlwind of self-reflection intertwined with deliberate action. Clarity began to surface. He would confront Claire directly, not as a competitor, but as a collaborator. This wasn't about displacing her views, it was about finding common ground in their mission to optimize the company while nurturing its human resources. With a plan hatching in his mind, James understood that confrontation was not only necessary but inevitable in his path toward becoming a transformative leader. As he initiated a conversation with Claire, he sensed something larger looming on the horizon, a tension stretching well beyond spreadsheets, acceptance, and resistance. As their discourse began to unfold, James braced himself not only for a potential alliance but for an awakening that could shift the very essence of their corporate identity. The time had come to face challenges he couldn't yet fully articulate, yet he knew one truth: in the realm of corporate destiny, collaboration or conflict would determine the nature of all futures. The air in the windowless conference room felt thick, like the pressure of unwritten fate weighing down on James's shoulders. Claire sat across from him, her sharp gaze unflinching, dissecting his every word with the precision of a seasoned analyst. Here, within these walls, the stakes had become intensely personal. "Collaboration," Claire echoed, her voice draped in skepticism. "What's the plan, James? Simply to trade relentless profit calculations for feel-good stories? Do you really think that can hold in this boardroom?" The challenge pulsed in the air, resonating beyond mere business strategy, thrusting the depth of his conviction into disarray. His pulse quickened in response to her directness. This sense of urgency awakened a blend of resolve and fear. Both sides of his mind wrestled, the idealist advocating for empathy against the pragmatist's insistence on traditional metrics. Claire wasn't just a colleague, she was an embodiment of the old guard, the very force he needed to overcome, but her motives were rooted, and to dismiss her would be foolish. He had to approach her with the nuance he had learned from Richard. "It's not about valuing stories over numbers," he replied, reining in his irritation. "It's about using them to inform our strategies. Employee satisfaction correlates with productivity metrics. Companies like Zappos and Google have proven this." He paused, allowing his assertion to resonate. "What I'm saying is, we can merge data-driven decisions with the human element. We need that balance." Claire leaned back, crossing her arms, the skepticism in her posture an unmistakable barrier. But James sensed a weakness in her armor, a flicker of nuance. He had studied her approach, noting the tension between her goals for the company and her desire to maintain her place among the power players at the board. The relentless ambition in her eyes masked an underlying insecurity. She didn't want to be the obstacle, she wanted to be part of progress. Her structure-focused demeanor confused him, igniting an awareness of his own journey. He had transformed from a hesitant employee to an advocate for change, so perhaps she held potential for growth too. "I want to find common ground," he asserted, "not to dismantle your data-driven strategies but to augment them. What if we test an initiative? Maybe a small pilot program focusing on employee engagement for a quarter?" James saw a momentary flicker of curiosity in Claire's expression. Her disciplined demeanor softened just enough, hinting she might be closer than he thought. "A pilot program," she echoed, tilting her head, considering the suggestion's viability. "Yes. It wouldn't cost us much, and if we layer it with performance metrics, we can present tangible results to the board. If it fails, we haven't lost much." If it succeeds, his words trailed off, charged with the hope that clouded their reality. If it succeeds, they would have evidence to elevate the empathetic agenda he so fervently believed in. Claire's eyes narrowed, analyzing the implications of his pitch, a shadow of her former skepticism quite visibly giving way to curiosity. "All right, James, let's say I'm on board. If the pilot program does yield positive metrics, then what?" A rush of optimism surged through him. It wasn't just about the numbers, it was about the potential acceptance of a new philosophy. "Then we bring those results to the board not as a debate of empathy versus profit but as a strategy for enhanced margins." He leaned forward, the gravity of this moment igniting a fire within him. "Imagine being able to shift the narrative. We can prove that caring for our employees positively impacts the bottom line. That's a narrative we can sell." With the air shifting toward collaboration, however, a weight still loomed in James's mind. He was stepping onto a tightrope, forging an alliance that could either fortify their mission or unravel it entirely. Would Claire uphold her end of the bargain when the conversations turned heated again? Or would the doubts of the board crush this small flame of progress before it could become a full flame? He sensed the fork in the path ahead. One direction may lead to collaboration, while the other could plunge him into deeper conflict. The time had arrived for action over discourse. As Claire nodded, her expression cautious but contemplative, James noticed how every moment of uncertainty had now merged into a new potency within him. He had risen to confront challenges that frightened him, and emerged with a plan. Yet, would the board strengthen their resolve or squelch it at first sight of fear again? The potential for a breakthrough ignited in his mind, but the specter of the board's ferocity loomed ahead. His heart raced not with fear this time, but with anticipation. Would they agree to take a chance? Would their pilot program ignite the kind of change James sought, or would it suggest failure and resignation? In that charged silence, James leaned back, absorbing the unfolding tension, realizing that whatever awaited him beyond this conversation could lead to an unprecedented shift not just for the company, but for himself. The defining moment was fast approaching. The weeks flowed swiftly into a blur of meetings, data analyses, and strategic preparations. The pilot program loomed before him like a specter. Its success or failure hinged upon variables that felt dauntingly out of his control. Each morning, James confronted the same question: would Claire's initial support remain steadfast, or would dissent bubble up from the depths of the boardroom culture they existed within? Doubts skittered at the edge of his consciousness. The voices of his former peers echoed in his mind, the cautionary tales of taking risks, of not straying from conventional paths. Yet, the blinding luminescence of possibility sparked his ambition. He had witnessed the sparks of hope emerge in the small interactions with his team. This initiative could cultivate a climate where innovation thrived, a fertile ground for the very change he wished to see. However, that hope alone couldn't stifle the reality fraying at the edges of his resolve. James dedicated hours to crafting a presentation that balanced the statistical data with potent stories of employee engagement. He needed to articulate the narrative that married hard numbers with the emotional aspects of the workplace. There was a personal urgency in this pursuit. Claire's input was crucial. He sought to engage her insights while demonstrating his resolve. They met frequently in the conference room, where the atmosphere gradually shifted. She became an unexpected partner in discussion, a strategist with valuable familiarity of the board's proclivities. Discussions mixed strategy with philosophy. For every retort he made, she responded with data-driven rebuttals, pushing him to refine his stance. Anticipation swelled within him when Claire began revealing her reservations about the board. "James, to the others, this harmonic philosophy you're pushing might just be a euphemism for weakness," she remarked one afternoon. "They thrive on competition, not cooperation." Her words hung in the air, the weight of her honesty stinging. She was revealing the true dynamics of the organization, laying bare the very climate he sought to alter. Yet in her struggle against cynicism, he saw her willingness to engage. "Maybe we can refract that narrative," he said, assessing her perspective. "If we frame employee satisfaction as a competitive advantage, we don't have to compromise on what we stand for." Claire regarded him closely, her eyes narrowing as if she sensed the threads of his argument weaving tighter. "That could work, but you will need to bring more than just theory to the table. We'll need real testimonials and hard data from the pilot itself. If we can quantify emotional engagement, it'll speak volumes." As they discussed this readed perspective, a revelation dawned on James. Claire's ambitions mirrored his own. Beneath the surface level of competition was an individual desperate for their voice to be acknowledged, afraid that taking risks might lead to personal jeopardy. This mirror effect heightened his confidence, propelling him to face the upcoming board meeting with a new vigor, a chance to stand on both sides of the divide. The day of the presentation arrived with an intense build-up of anticipation. Walking toward the boardroom, he felt an electric tremor of energy coursing through him, the kind that teetered on the edge of excitement and fear. His heart raced as he stepped into the boardroom, now filled with paper-strewn tables and heavy scrutiny. Would his vision resonate amidst the vacuous echoes of their established outlook? Before speaking, he caught the eyes of Claire, who offered him a subtle nod, a fleeting reminder that he wasn't alone in this tempest. He took a deep breath, centering himself as he began to outline their carefully crafted pilot program, interspersing his analysis with compelling employee stories that illuminated the necessity and humanity behind the initiative. But as he revealed the program's objectives and the anticipated metrics, a shadow of skepticism settled over the room. There were questions, digs at the emotional aspect he emphasized. Delving into traditional profit-driven inquiries that threatened to undermine his resolve. As the questions thickened like fog, James felt the familiar tremor of doubt ripple through him, but he wasn't about to back down now. This was the moment to challenge their established narratives. "What if," he pressed, attempting to root his voice in conviction, "shift our focus not solely on profit margins but on cultivating an environment where our employees thrive, would yield not only a benefit in morale but a measurable impact in returns?" Silence draped the room thick and heavy. The gaze of each board member juxtaposed the uncompromising foundation of tradition against the flickering light of a proposed change. Their expressions stirred within him an urgency like never before. The stakes had never felt more personal. Would they engage in the transformational vision he proposed or clench their beliefs, retreating into familiar justifications? With the tension palpable, James fortified himself for their response, knowing now that whatever came next would shape not just the company, but his own journey in this unrelenting labyrinth of ambition and doubt. And as he paused, the moment crystallized, a cauldron of possibilities simmering. Would he be met with resistance, or would his vision brainchild take root? The answer lay within their grasp, and with it, the true test of his commitment to this vision. In the tense air of the boardroom, James had carved out a space not just for his ideas, but for the courage that had begun to define him. As the silence hung, he felt the weight of anticipation pressing down on him, the eyes of his colleagues metaphorically scrutinizing every aspect of his proposal. This moment felt seismic, a culmination of his transformation from janitor to influencer within the corporate structure. Richard, seated at the head of the table, shifted in his seat, his expression a nuanced blend of hope and caution. It had taken weeks of pushing against the entrenched ideologies of their board to get to this point, and now the time for action had arrived. James could see the flickers of doubt around the room morphing into consideration as they absorbed his passionate presentation. "James," Claire interjected, her voice cutting through the thick air. "What you're proposing defies conventional wisdom. How do we quantify the return on investment of employee satisfaction?" Feeling a surge of adrenaline, James seized upon the opening. "By aligning our values with measurable results. We can implement employee feedback systems that capture engagement levels, commitment, and morale, quantifying what traditionally slipped through the cracks in experience-driven perspective. And if we can prove that higher engagement correlates directly with productivity metrics, we will display not just the power of empathy, but its potential for yielding profits." He saw nods from a few board members, a welcomed flicker of acknowledgement illuminated by shared understanding. The verbal sparring turned into a dance of ideas. James sold not just a program, but a new way of viewing success. This wasn't merely about softening the edges of business, it was about fortifying their corporate identity for a more sustainable future. "You have a compelling premise, James," Richard spoke up, his tone measured but with a glimmer of burgeoning confidence. "Perhaps we should test this pilot initiative, gauge its real impact as we go. If we deliver tangible results, it can lend credence to the ideas you passionately advocate." A collective murmur spread through the boardroom, reflecting the simmering debate mixed with curiosity. The weight of Richard's endorsement was significant, it bolstered James's position. Claire met James's gaze across the table, masked surprise blending into a spark of camaraderie. "Yes, let us pursue this," Claire echoed, "but not blindly. We must establish metrics for success and a timeline for assessment. I believe this could yield empirical evidence to support our strategies moving forward, proving that empathy can coexist with fiscal discipline." The atmosphere shifted abruptly, energy coursing through the previously hesitant board. Questions transformed from skepticism to proactive queries about implementation and metrics. As James engaged with the board, feeling more a part of the discussion than ever before, he demonstrated that he was not just a janitor who had stumbled into the world of finance. He was now a strategic partner, equipped with both data and human insights. He navigated through various inquiries with confidence, his ideas becoming increasingly robust under the fervent engagement of those around him. After a lengthy session, Richard leaned back, looking positively energized. "Let us draw up a framework for this initiative. James, Claire, and I will collaborate on setting the parameters of the pilot. If we can prove the viability of employee satisfaction as a tangible asset, the board will be more inclined to invest in this direction long-term." In that instant, James grasped the gravity of the transformation not just in the company, but within himself. He had moved from feeling like an insignificant entity in the vast machinery of the corporate sector to becoming a linchpin in a critical change process. The acknowledgement from peers, their interest in his insights, signified, he was now an integral voice among them. Later that day, as he stepped into the sunlight, James couldn't shake the elation. The city sprawled around him, it mirrored the expansive potential of newfound confidence. He thought of Lily, how he wanted to build a future where she could explore paths unburdened by the limitations he had faced. Yet, there was a sense of accountability that weighed on him. Accomplishing change would demand resilience, and the shift in corporate culture would not happen overnight. James realized he was not just advocating for empathy, he was challenging an entire paradigm interwoven with generations of tradition. As the meaning of his role crystallized, he felt an invigorating purpose fueling him, a newly defined American aspiration to redefine success. This pilot program could be his legacy, the key to establishing an environment where loyalty and innovation flourished hand in hand. Yet, even more, it was a testament to his evolution. He had confronted Richard, challenged the established order, and stood his ground for the humanity that often went unnoticed. Every stride he took resonated with a solid confidence, the echoes of a janitor morphing into the voice of transformation. He achieved a concrete affirmation of his growth, recognizing that true change stemmed not just from authority, but from empathy, understanding, and the courage to speak out. As he returned home, he grinned, feeling proud both of himself and the journey still unfolding. He had risen beyond his past, reshaping not only his narrative but laying the groundwork for others in the workforce. The true advent of change lay ahead, and James stood ready to lead, proving that authenticity could indeed define success on both the personal and corporate stage. This was merely the beginning, and every ounce of faith in his vision meant he would not shy away from the next fight for their collective future. If you're inspired by these stories of personal transformation, you need to subscribe now. This is the moment to show your support and engage with more exclusive emotional narratives. Leave a like now to feed the algorithm and boost thought-provoking content. Comment below your reactions and theories about James's transformative journey and how it resonates within the workforce today. Share instantly this video with at least 5 friends who need to see this conclusion. It might just trigger their own journey toward empowerment. Don't wait even one more second. Your support amplifies these uplifting stories.